So I'm going to go through how to do an analytical essay. Now, some of this is going to be a bit of a review, and that's okay. It's been, almost a month since we were in class. So, but I'm going to go through just kind of the parts of an analytical essay. Of course, we're going to be focused on analyzing poetry. So, first of all, let's look at what analysis does. And this specifically is review because we did talk about this in class. Analysis basically explores how something works. I mean, that's the gist of what analysis is doing. It examines the working parts and how they interrelate. So what are all the parts of the thing that we're analyzing? And how do they interrelate to each other? How do they function together? What is the relationship between each of the different parts? And how does each contribute? Analytical writing is going to make a claim about how what we're analyzing works. And part of that claim is going to be what the implications of that are. What does that mean? Of course, keep in mind, analysis is a subset of persuasive writing. Analytical writing is a type of persuasive writing. So you need to support the claim that you're making with arguments and with evidence. And that's where you're really getting into the details and really taking apart how what you're analyzing is put together. And then you want to conclude by making it meaningful, telling the reader what they can get from this. Why does this matter to them? That's basically what analysis does. So let's look at the different parts. Now, keep in mind we're doing specifically poetry. That's what I've got you focused on, just for making the essay and kind of teaching how to do it a little bit more simple. But you can apply this to anything. But some of the details we're looking at is going to be specific to poetry. So keep in mind, if you're analyzing something else, you're going to take a different approach, right? Because different things are composed of different parts. But we're looking specifically at how poetry works in this one. So in your thesis, you're going to do basically four things. You're going to summarize, give an overview of the poem. Now, this is broad. You're not going into kind of a bullet point, every single detail, every single part. You're doing a very basic overview. Think of it like this. The person who's reading your essay, or the people who will read your essay, are going to be people who have actually read the poem before. Nobody else is going to read an analytical essay on a poem. Why would you bother, right? If you're interested in poetry, just read some poetry itself, right? Nobody's just going to go read an analysis of a poem unless they've read the poem and are interested in what other people have to say about it, right? So your overview doesn't really need to touch on every single detail. It needs to be broad, right? Then you're going to make a claim about how the poem works. You're going to identify the poem's theme. Now, a poem is an expressive piece of art, right? The theme is part of what the poem is presenting, right? It's commenting on a particular aspect of morality or philosophy or human life existence. So you want to identify what that theme is, and your claim is going to be how the poem explores that theme. Basically, how does the poem work to make a comment or ask a question about that particular concept? And then you're going to describe significant poetic elements or sequential parts of the poem. And we'll look at kind of what the difference between those two are a little bit later. So let's look at an example. Now, I told you guys for this week to go into the poetry analysis document and skim over the Lake Isle of Innisfree. I'm going to show you an example essay. This is in that document that is about the Lake Isle of Innisfree. So this is the example we're looking at. So that's why I asked you to reread the poem. So here it is. This is short. This is really short. We're doing a short 5-paragraph essay, so you don't need a whole lot. Now, I said 4 things, but look at this. I've only got 2 sentences. Really short introductory paragraph. But that's okay, is because I've got all 4 elements. So in Lake Isle of Innisfree, William Butler Yeats, always remember to identify the poem's title and the poet's full name. So in Lake Isle of Innisfree, William Butler Yeats explores a man's desire to escape an uninspired and mundane urban existence and go to a natural setting. Through shifting imagery and contrasting details, the poem explores the power of imagination. So let's look back at the parts that are supposed to be there. A summary or overview, claim about how it works, identification of the theme, and description of significant poetic elements or parts. Here's my overview, right? Exploring a man's desire to escape a boring existence, go to a natural setting, right? So that's the overview, very broad overview, right? And then here I've got my poetic elements, shifting imagery and contrasting details. And then I've got my concept, my theme, the power of imagination. And this is my claim. You see how all these fit together. Through shifting imagery and contrasting details, the poem explores the power of imagination. This is how it works. It uses shifting imagery and contrasting details, and it explores this theme. So I've identified the theme, I've made a claim about how it works, and within that claim, I mentioned some significant poetic elements, the shifting imagery and contrasting details. Pretty simple, 2 sentences. Now, if you're writing a more elaborate analysis that's maybe 20, 30 pages long for some upper-level college course, your introduction to your analytical essay may end up being longer, right? But for this, we're doing just a 5-paragraph essay. That's enough to touch on those things. Summary, overview, claim about how the poem works, identification of the theme, and description of significant poetic elements or parts. Now, you could touch on, when we look at the body paragraphs, I'll show you how I did this, but you could touch on kind of like the sequence of how the poem plays out the ideas. So it begins with this, it moves to that, and it ends on that. That's another approach. I mentioned imagery and contrasting details in my introductory paragraph. So, all right. So then moving into the body paragraphs. Remember, like I said, analysis is a subset of persuasion. So in your body paragraphs, you're going to get into your arguments and your evidence. So you want to have in your body paragraphs toward the beginning a topic sentence which focuses on a particular poetic element or a sequential part. And the topic sentence is kind of like the thesis for the paragraph, right? But remember, it's also an argument that supports your main thesis. And so that's kind of, you're really supporting and you're developing, you're expanding on, providing evidence for that main claim about how the poem works, right? So that topic sentence focus on a particular poetic element or on a particular sequential part. And then provide evidence. So these are the details, the specific wording, specific use of elements in the poem. And then explain how the evidence supports the argument. And remember that you're always pointing back to the thesis itself, right? So kind of keep that in mind. So let's look at an example from the Lake Isle of Innisfree poem, essay. So now I've got 2 paragraphs and part of a third. I'm going to look through the first one, but I'm going to show you kind of how I set up the sequence of my paragraphs. That's why I included part of the others, but we're not going to go through all of them. So let's look at what it says. So in the first stanza, Yeats describes his plan for Innisfree as a simple, natural life. Now, let's go back. Topic sentence focused on a particular poetic element or sequential part. This is a sequential part. You see how I did that? In the first stanza, Yeats describes his plan for Innisfree as a simple, natural life. And here's my point. Here's what I'm saying about this first part. So in this first stanza, we start with this concept. We start with the poem doing this, right? And then look at the beginning of this paragraph. This sense of escape is made more clear in the second stanza, where he transitions from a physical description to a description of an emotional response. So you see how I've divided the paragraphs. Each of the paragraphs is one part of the poem, and my topic sentences are making a claim that supports the main thesis about how each of those parts works and what is contained within those parts, what's happening within those parts, right? So in this paragraph, I'm looking at the first stanza. He plans to build, quote, a small cabin of clay and wattles. The image of primitive life evokes purity and simplicity. So here's a piece of evidence. Now, you see how that's evidence of this, right? He plans to build a small cabin of clay and wattles. He wants to live a simple, natural life, right? He's building the cabin out of clay and grass, basically, right? He's building a thatch hut. That goes with a simple, natural life. And then this explains how that evidence works. The image of primitive life evokes purity and simplicity, you see how that points back to the word simple in the first. So evidence with some explanation, a little commentary on it. Continuing on, he also describes his plan to grow 9 bean rows and a hive for the honeybee to sustain himself with his own work. He wants to make a personal and individual journey to the island and to live by the work of his own hand. So more evidence, and then an explanation as to how that evidence works, right? He says he will live alone in the bee-loud glade, freeing himself even from the complications of other people. A subtle hint at the fact that going to the island represents an escape. Going there and living his simple, self-sustaining lifestyle will allow him to find himself by himself, away from the pressures of society. Now, more evidence, more explanation. And this last sentence kind of wraps up everything that I said in the paragraph, and it sets up what I'm going to do in the next paragraph, right? Now, let me point out a couple of things. Look back at that first paragraph. Look at my description. Exploring a man's desire to escape an uninspired urban existence and go to a natural setting. You see how my evidence and my commentary relates to not only my topic sentence in the paragraph, but it also points back to the thesis. Always remember that everything you do should point back to the thesis. All right? And so then the second body paragraph moves to the second stanza, and then the third body paragraph moves to the third stanza. The final stanza presents the reason for his desire. So that's your body paragraphs, and you want to have 3 of those. And then the last thing you're going to do is the conclusion. And the conclusion, there's only 2 things you're doing there. Reviewing your thesis and your arguments, without repeating yourself, of course, and then presenting a thematic statement. So just kind of touch back on what you've already said. And you're just kind of bringing it all to a close, right? So you want to point back to what you've already said, but you don't want to say the same stuff again, right? You want to say it with a little nuance added, because as it all has built up, it should lead to kind of some concluding statements, right? And so review those ideas, but don't say what you've already said a second time. Say them in a new way, with kind of an understanding of how it all fits together. And then your thematic statement is basically the point that your reading takes us to. Your reading and your analysis of the poem should take us to a particular idea. And this idea is going to be something that's it's going to be conceptual. It's going to be philosophical, some kind of moral statement, or some kind of social statement, or maybe a political statement, right? Something about how we how we interact with the world, what our significance is, how we treat other people, something like that, right? It needs to be universal, which it needs to be broader than the poem, right? So in this poem, he's talking about going to an island. But I don't want my thematic statement to be about going to an island. I want it to be something broader than that. What is the concept outside of the poem that the poem works as an example of or a commentary on? And then it needs to be non-absolute. And non-absolute basically means that you don't want it to be a 100% always absolutely true statement. So you want to use words like some, sometimes, often, maybe, may, might, something like that, to show that this isn't always true, but it often is, or it sometimes is, or it might be, because you want to escape those, you want to avoid those absolute statements, because if they're untrue once, then they're untrue. You see how that works? So if I say, for instance, telling a lie is a bad thing, and a lot of people will agree with that. But how about this? Somebody gets a new haircut, and it just looks ridiculous. And you don't want to tell them that they look ridiculous. Does my new haircut make me look bad? You don't want to say yes, because you're going to hurt their feelings. You want to give it a little time and then maybe point them toward a new hairstyle after it's grown out a little bit or something, right? So telling a lie in that situation is not necessarily a bad thing. But usually it is. Right? So telling a lie is usually a bad choice. That's better than giving that absolute statement, which it's easy to think of examples when that may not be true, right? So let's look at the example. All right. A deeper truth, in fact, is Yeats's focus in the poem. Though the majority of the poem deals in descriptions of physical details, from the lifestyle plans of the first stanza to the cycle of days in the second stanza to the contrasting lake and street scenes in the third, the last line gives a clear view of what really matters to the speaker. Beyond the significance of the physical world for the speaker is his true inner self. The plan to go is not a real plan, but rather an emotional escape. And he need not go to the island for the peace and fulfillment it will provide, because, the poem suggests, the outer physical world may not be as important as a deep inner truth. Okay, so reviewing the thesis and arguments, and then getting to that point to be taken from the poem. So let's take a look at it. So I start with a hint at what this thematic statement's about. And that's okay. You don't necessarily have to do it in order. I review what I've been through, right? The majority of the poem deals in descriptions of physical details, from what happens in the first to the second to the third stanzas, right? And then I come to the last line. The last line gives a clear view of what really matters. You see how I'm leaning toward what the statement is going to be, and then the statement is this: the outer physical world may not be as important as a deep inner truth. That is universal, though some people may not agree with it. That could apply to everybody's life, right? It's not specific to the poem. You see how the poem does deal with that, but I'm not saying anything about the island or the birds flying in the evenings or the bees, because that's not what the theme is. The theme is broader than the poem itself. The outer physical world may not be as important. So it's broad, it's universal. It is conceptual, right? Because it's about what's really important to us. It's what's inside is more important than what's outside, right? That's a conceptual thing. It's kind of a philosophical idea. And then it is non-absolute, because I said it may not be as important as deep inner truth, right? If I said it is, that would be absolute, right? You see the difference? So it may not be as important. You want it to be, you want that non-absolute element, that modifier or something that gives you that non-absolute statement. The outer physical world may not be as important as a deep inner truth. And that's the point that I've brought you to through the analysis. And like I said, you can go back through and read the entire essay, but that's just kind of a general overview, and that as an example. Keep in mind, in the document that I shared with you guys, that essay's there, and there are also two other examples of essays. There's one for We Real Cool, and there's one for In a Station in the Metro. So you can look at those, and each of those has a slightly different approach. And so you can definitely see three different ways of doing it. I also did some of the drafting and the analysis notes and stuff like that. So just kind of going back over again, analysis, remember, explores how something works. It examines the working parts, how they interrelate, makes a claim about how the text works, and it talks about the implications of that. And then, of course, as an argumentative type of writing, it supports the claim with arguments and evidence, and, of course, explanation of the evidence. And then it concludes by making it meaningful to the reader. You get to that thematic statement, which is universal. And then in your thesis and intro, you want to remember to summarize, give an overview of the poem, make a claim about how the poem works, identify the poem's theme, and then touch on significant poetic elements or specific parts. In your body paragraphs, you want to start each body paragraph with a topic sentence focused on a particular poetic element or sequential part. You want to provide evidence, and then you want to explain how the evidence supports the argument. And always remember that you're pointing back to the thesis. And then in your conclusion, rehash those ideas that you went through, the thesis, the arguments, touch a little bit on it, and then lead toward that thematic statement. What is the point that is being taken? What is the question being asked? What suggestion is being made to us about how to live our lives, how to see the world, how to treat each other, whatever your poem deals with. All right? So there you go. I hope that's helpful. Send me some emails with some comments. Let me know whether that worked for you. And I'll be in touch with you guys.